Welcome back to the evolution of horror and to this very special bonus episode. Now, if you tuned into the most recent episode that came out on Friday, you may have heard a short snippet of my conversation with film composer and musician Neil Brand. I just wanted the chance to play you the entire conversation because we sat down and talked for nearly an hour about a sort of history of horror movie music, the sort of tropes, the formulas, the characteristics of a horror score, and how they've changed and evolved over the last 100 years from silent cinema through to now. It's a really, really fascinating conversation. Neil Brand is brilliant. There will be information about Neil, his website, his music, his events at the end of the podcast as well. So please do listen through to the very end. But here is my chat with the brilliant Neil Brand. Neil, welcome.
Thank you. Very good to be here.
Now, Neil, I am a big fan of yours and of your music, but for anyone who doesn't know, please just tell me a little bit about what you do.
Well, I started life really as a silent film pianist. I was always interested in how music worked with film, and I could always play by ear. And I fell into this very odd specialist job back in the 1980s, and learnt my trade at the National Film Theatre. But then in the last few years, that sort of expanded out to talking about film music in general. And also I write. And I have a kind of crusading zeal about cinema music in particular, because when I was growing up, formal music education basically meant that if you didn't understand music, you weren't supposed to understand what it meant either. Mm-hmm. And the very idea of things like film music was sort of dismissed, almost as being like too accessible in some strange way.
Right.
So part of my kind of ambition of the last 30 years has been to demystify the process of how music's working when it's telling a story. Mainly because it occurred to me quite early on that when a director and a composer sit down together, they are not talking about cadenzas and 3/4 time and symphonic style or any of those things. They're probably talking in terms of colour or emotion or mood. And as such, if all those conversations are taking place in normal language, why can't the conversations about what music is and what it does take place in normal language? So that's really where all that's come from.
Yeah, it's so true. One of my favourite interviews is Angelo Badalamenti talking about when he and David Lynch created the Twin Peaks music together. And that's exactly it, isn't it? You know, David Lynch is just going, there's trees and there's woods and there's, and it's sad and, it's just brilliant. And you're totally right. It's about mood and colour and everything else with film. And I suppose anyone can make interpretations and talk about film music, can't they? That's the thing.
Yeah. But I remember when I interviewed Richard Rodney Bennett, who was one of my all-time heroes as a film composer, he said the hardest directors to work for were the ones who knew anything about music. Because they would almost certainly hit you with something from way off left field.
Right.
I want something that sounds like Bartok at this point. Which actually is deeply unhelpful. It's much more helpful to be told, I need a piece of music that chills at this point, because then you're on common ground. Everybody knows what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And tell me, I'm not very up on sort of silent film accompaniment and how it works, but is it like you have a kind of set piece of music for a certain film, and or is it more that you can kind of take liberties with when you're accompanying a silent movie? Go with it?
The beauty of it is that certainly as a piano player, I'm entirely improvising.
Right.
So you improvise.
That's amazing.
Everything.
Yeah.
But you can do it in such a way that people think they're hearing a score. Mm-hmm. I've, over the years, and this is part of the reason I still do the job, it is so massively enjoyable.
Yeah.
You sit in front of a film, even if it's a film you've not seen before, you start to play and you start to make decisions as you're watching of what this film is, where it's going, who the characters are, what they're going to do. And you begin to shape the music for that unique film in that unique moment. And if you get it right, the film begins to react to the music in a strange way. And the two are absolutely kind of symbiotic. When people watch the film and hear the music, they're not thinking, oh, there's a piano player down there.
No.
They're thinking, I'm enjoying this film and the music's telling me this much and the film's telling me that much. And also when it comes to scoring films, because I've now scored quite a few for orchestra with the BBC Symphony Orchestra, To be absolutely frank, Mike, the best thing about it is the director's dead. You know? You are on your own. There's no one to tell you what to write.
Yeah.
And that is just extraordinary. So, I mean, last year I had this fantastic opportunity to score the original Douglas Fairbanks Robin Hood. 2 hours, 10 minutes.
Wonderful.
Of fantastic, fast-moving, swashbuckling stuff with a full orchestra. I think we had over 100 players eventually. And you can be Korngold, you can be Bernard Herrmann, you can be John Williams, you can be Danny Elfman, you can be all those people you want to be.
That's brilliant.
To actually just support this extraordinary filmmaker. And, you know, and there's Doug climbing up castle walls and swinging around all over the place and doing sword fights. Nothing more enjoyable than doing something like that, without drawing on any particular original music, but drawing like mad on original film composers who I admire.
That's great. And also what makes that so special is, you know, when you go and see a movie then like that, you know, that you're accompanying, it's going to be a complete unique experience, I suppose. You know, you will never get that same experience with that exact same music again.
No. And also I feel that the thing about music, whether it's improvised or film music, written film music, it has to be transformative. In other words, the music's got to make a difference. It's got to be telling you something that isn't there on the screen. And another wonderful job I enjoyed doing is working with the Dodge Brothers, which is Mark Kermode and the Skiffle Blues Band, Mike Hammond. And what we do is, one of the films we do is actually a Soviet movie from the late 1920s called The Ghost That Never Returns, which is about a revolutionary, very dangerous revolutionary, who's as far as the authorities are concerned, who's allowed out of this prison after a 10-year stretch for one day to go and visit his family. And he knows that when they do that, it's because they're going to assassinate him on the way to seeing his family. And we just follow him. But it's set in Georgia. But because of what we, the Dodgers and me, do, it suddenly becomes an Alabama prison movie. And the whole thing's happening in the southern states of America. And it feels like a piece of Americana. Fantastic. Now, that could not be more of a change if you tried it. We've basically ripped it away from Avram Room, Soviet director, and we've put it into a genre that people do know about and already understand. You know, the whole prison ethic thing, you know, Prison Break. And it looks like a really tough Southern American jail, where the cells are actually up 7 floors, and there is nothing for the prisoners to do, and there's just a single revolving sort of gun turret in front of all these cells, just ready to take out anybody who even blinks the wrong way. That is what I think is so good about bringing music to the silence, is that although the purists would throw up their hands in horror, we know that The Ghost That Never Returns works because what we're doing with it is making it an American experience, an American genre that people already know that genre and are all over it.
Yeah, it suddenly makes that so much more accessible to audiences, doesn't it? Yeah. Wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about the horror genre. Just, you know, actually, first of all, what's your relationship like with the horror genre? Are you a fan of horror movies?
I'm way too much of a wimp to be able to really enjoy horror movies. I find it really uncomfortable to sit waiting for that next jolt because... I think I'm just way too susceptible. I can't go and enjoy it much as I would love to. Having said that, I've seen quite a lot of horror, and certainly as far as the genre is concerned and the music's concerned, it is fascinating how the music is used under those circumstances and what approaches you can make, because there are probably more musical approaches to horror than there are to many other genres. Yeah. Because horror in itself obviously splits off into subdivisions.
It's so broad, yeah.
It really is. Certainly, you know, the process of the history of scoring horror is fascinating. I mean, I was a huge fan of all the very early Universal horrors. I loved the Hammer horrors, you know, because as you know, Peter Cushing said, they're fairy stories. Yeah, really, you know.
Yeah.
And so I grew up with that being my idea of what was terrifying was Hammer. Yeah, we've moved on so far.
We have, yeah.
That now just feels like baby steps in horror movies, you know. I mean, it's Psycho now feels like the great-great-great-great-grandfather of every other horror film.
It does. I know.
It's a long time ago.
I mean, what if we go all the way back to the beginning, to the silent movies like Nosferatu, for example? I mean, how would you define, I suppose, the characteristics of a horror score, or how would you accompany a movie like Nosferatu?
In terms of all horror, I mean, I have heard the original score that was written for Nosferatu, and I have to say it's terribly polite, very classical.
Is it? Yeah.
But the thing about horror sound is that 9 times out of 10, I think what you're hearing is much more frightening than what you're seeing.
Yes.
And in my case, I can trace that back to the fact that when I was a kid and I was watching something that might scare me, I didn't put my hands over my eyes, I put my fingers in my ears.
Yeah.
Because somehow or other you could imagine the worst thing you could see, but you couldn't imagine the worst thing you could hear.
Yeah.
And you still see that with kids now, that, you know, they're watching something and as they start to get a bit tense, they bring their knees up under their chins and then they stick their fingers in their ears. And it is like kind of, you know, oh! So for Nosferatu, I would do what I think all music for horror attempts to do, which is to put the audience into a place where they don't feel safe. That sense of both isolation, disconnect, if you like, with normality, and also a creeping sense of dread, are absolutely central to how an audience is kind of, you know, put where they're put for film. It's interesting that with something like Nosferatu, you've actually got an odd mix, and I think an absolutely brilliant mix of the time, of horror and romance.
Yes.
There is within it a deeply perverse sense that we are rooting for Graf Orlok, the vampire, in that he is somehow or other hugely admirable as a force, whether it's an evil force or not. But his power and his sense of self are so much more strong than any of the other characters in the film.
Yeah.
And with Nosferatu particularly, there is a sense that he kind of falls in love with Mina Harker, who's the woman back in wherever you want to call it, whether it's Scarborough as it would have been in the original novel, or whether it's Wittenberg or wherever it is in the film. And that he kind of brings about his own destruction by falling for her. And then when Herzog made the Nosferatu remake in the 1980s, he made that absolutely overt, that the Klaus Kinski vampire does fall for Mina. She knows that. She invites him to her room, and there's a fantastic end sequence, which is almost shot for shot like the silent version, where he's feeding on her neck.
That's right, yeah.
But in Kinski's version, he starts to see the sun come up, which is going to kill him. He looks at the window, and she just puts her hand over his head and draws it back down to her neck again. And there is a fantastic sort of tactile warmth to that, as well as the chill of horror. Yeah. Interestingly, when Hammer came to score their movies, they decided, I think, very shrewdly to go for the idea of atonal music being what would make people feel uncomfortable. And, of course, the great James Bernard was the finest of all the composers for Hammer and did most of their work. And he would spell out the titles of the films in what he was doing. So Dracula was always Jum, ba-dum.
Yes.
And then Taste the Blood of Dracula, if I remember right, it was something like dum, bum, 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 ba-dum. But what the musical director at Hammer, Phil Martell, made a very clever decision, which was to basically contact the very, very, very best composers of concert music, modern classical music that there were. So Malcolm Williamson, who ended up as the master of the Queen's music, he scored a couple of Hammer films. Elizabeth Lutyens did the most gorgeous score for, I think... one of the werewolf films. I think it's the one with Oliver Reed.
Right, yes.
And the music is off kilter by the standards of what you would have expected popular classical music to sound like in the 1950s, 1960s. But in and of itself, wonderful storytelling as well. So there is a kind of sense that the world is out of joint as soon as you hear that music start. And in James Bernard's case, the music was usually furious and building and this oncoming rush of absolute and utter evil, which unfortunately kind of blows itself out quite quickly. That's my problem with James Bernard, is that if you're not careful, that's all you get.
It hasn't got anywhere more to go.
It's got nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes not dissimilar to someone yelling in your ear, God, this is frightening, isn't it? This is so frightening.
1960, then you've got Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. What sort of changed then at that point then, would you say, in terms of horror scores and horror music?
I think what Herrmann pulled off very specifically with that shower scene, and what no one had really had the guts to do before, was to not make the music about the horror of the moment, just to make it about the practical sounds of the moment. Now, there's always been this suggestion that Hitchcock didn't want to score the shower scene, and that somehow or other Herrmann scored it on the quiet and then played it to Hitchcock, and Hitchcock loved it. Well, if you unpack that idea, that means that Hitchcock was all set to make the shower scene with ordinary sound. Well, I'm sorry, but the sound of a human body being pierced with a knife again and again and again and again and again would have been absolutely unrateable in terms of what the censor would have done.
Yes.
No way that could happen. I think it's probably much more likely that Hitchcock knew that. And also because I think Saul Bass was obviously involved in that sequence somewhere along the lines as well. There's so much Saul Bass style of imagery in there.
Yeah.
And Bass's big kind of modus operandi when he was doing opening title sequences was he'd be working very closely with the composer. So if we come back to it now as what Bernard Herrmann does, that sense of the stabbing string chords getting deeper and deeper, as in the chord gets thicker, he adds in more and more bass end of strings. So it starts with just the first violins, then it's the first and seconds, then it's the first seconds of violas, then it's the first second violas, cellos, then it's the first second violas, cellos and basses.
Yeah.
So there is this horrible sense of kind of something going deeper and deeper and deeper. That is chilling enough on its own, but it's not going, oh, how awful this is happening.
No.
It's not going, help, help, get me out of here. It's not doing any of those things. It's making the sound of a knife, end of. And I think that is a kind of new brutalism in horror movies. Up till then, the music would have somehow or other reflected either our sense of horror at what we were watching, or Janet Leigh's sense of horror at what she was going through, and this doesn't. It's one of the things about Herrmann, which you notice, is that he is a cold composer. The music for Vertigo is fantastically romantic, but most of his music doesn't have that warmth. It doesn't have that that depth of humanity. It is fantastic sounding. It works a treat. It really does represent the mood or the mise en scène or whatever it is he's supposed to be scoring. But there's not an awful lot of humanity there.
No.
And in the shower sequence, there is precisely none. That is a mincing machine that he's composed there. And I think that's what flips the coin. The Hammer horrors, you see, are all about the horror. Literally, the music is telling you the emotion. He's absolutely not. And the fact that he uses only a string section for that film is in and of itself a very kind of deliberate attempt. So you've got no horns, you've got no woodwinds, you've got no percussion. You've only got this cold and quite stark use of an orchestra as a single instrument.
Yeah.
Doing what it does. So that fantastic sequence with the car trip and the windscreen wipers going, and that beautiful piece that he writes for that. Well, even there, some of those little high movement dee da dee 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 da dee da 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 da, is kind of not really giving any emotion to that sequence at all. It's kind of, and actually Hitchcock has loads of time go by of Janet Leigh driving with no music at all.
Yeah.
And with no sense of anything except what's going on back where she's left, where they're going, hang on, why haven't we found this money? Where has she gone? What do you mean she's left in a car?
Yes.
Blah, blah. There's no sense that we are being drawn to, as attracted to her.
Yes.
Or wanting her to get away with it, or wanting her to be caught even. It's completely left open as to whether or not she's a good person, bad person, or whatever. And when she dies, the music does the same thing. It does not call upon us to pity her death.
No. And yet somehow it's so tense that all that sequence in the car when she's driving is I suppose the problem is with the shower scene is that everyone knows it with their eyes closed. And actually now upon rewatch, I find everything leading up to the shower scene more scary and much suspenseful more. When she's driving in the rain and when she stops to swap cars and all that. Yeah. It's just fantastically done. But you're right, it is. And I suppose that's the thing about that whole film, after the death and we're suddenly following Norman and we don't quite know how we feel about any of these characters, do we, I suppose? So it has to have that ambiguity.
Yeah. Psycho is Hitchcock's greatest outing as a manipulator.
Yes, totally.
Of people. He is uncaringly moving these pieces around his chessboard. And he doesn't give a toss about anything except making sure the audience are on the back foot the whole time and get these shocks when they come.
Yeah.
And we're not really that fussed about who gets killed and who doesn't, except towards the very end when it would be really nice if somebody survived the whole business and somebody we liked would be even better. And it is a surprise when you get Norman Bates as the mum, and then there's this great long explanation afterwards when you really don't need.
It's a brilliant moment of exposition. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So so he was a fruitcake and he was 6 minutes on white. But you can tell that Hitch was just loving being able to use a TV crew to, like I say, play as God. Yeah. With a chessboard. Yeah. And Bernard Herrmann gave him precisely the score he needed for that. So you don't have an emotional attachment to those people. And maybe that is where the horror movie grows up. Yeah. Maybe that's the point at which, we cared pretty deeply about the characters in The Spiral Staircase or about some of the characters in the Hammer horrors, and certainly the characters in the Universal horrors. There was a sense that you were rooting for someone. Yeah, quite often rooting for the guy who was the monster, Lon Chaney Jr. or whatever. But after Psycho, it's like you don't have to. You don't have to care anymore. No, just watch what is going to happen to these people. And I suppose, thank God, it's not you. Maybe that's the ultimate thing that vicariously you go through hell with somebody else and just think, well, that goes. Which I can only assume, and I'm really not a fan of torture porn. No, but I assume that is what is great about Saw for those who like Saw. Yeah, is that you kind of are amazed and sort of delightedly disgusted with what can be done to human beings in terms of putting them through hell. And then you can go off and have an Indian and go home to bed. Yeah, so true. And I guess that's why a lot of the time people cite Psycho as one of the forerunners of the sort of slasher. I mean, apart from the fact that it's got somebody being slashed with a knife, but it grows into that format with things like Friday the 13th and Halloween, where you're just watching it for the body count, basically, not for anything else. Absolutely so. Yeah, absolutely so. With a film like Halloween, where you have such a cold, chillingly cold score by John Carpenter for his own film. There again, that music is both freezing cold and inevitable. I love it. I mean, I love Carpenter stuff, and I really, really hope that he is going to be scoring this new Halloween that's going to be coming out. But as you say, it's a body count. You're just watching the ducks go down as each shot happens.
Yeah.
And how it's going to happen. And yeah, with a film like Final Destination, for goodness sake,
yes.
that is all there is.
Yes.
Ultimately, this lot are all going to be for the chop. It's just a question of how.
Yeah.
So I don't think any other of the great composers of the golden age of Hollywood could possibly have scored Psycho the way Bernard Herrmann did, because Herrmann had a slightly terrifying ability to step back from the humanity of any situation and just score the mechanics. And that's kind of what Carpenter's done. That's certainly what many horror film scores these days do, is this drip of sensibility within the music. And if you think, what makes a great ghost story to read, the thing about great ghost stories is that the sense of unease grows exponentially as you continue down the path. And the point at which the biggest shock comes, usually that shock is when that very last vestige of security that may still be there is ripped away.
Yeah.
Well, that's really how a great horror film score should work, is that it should build that sense of unease, and as the unease gets greater and the horror becomes more palpable and more unexpected, meets those points when the audience meet them and matches them for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Just moving through briefly, actually, from Psycho. I mean, obviously, what Hitchcock did next with The Birds, which in some ways is even more of a pure horror movie, isn't it? Like a monster movie almost. But obviously, he did something completely different with that, didn't he?
Oh, totally. But I mean, The Birds is one of the first uses of entirely electronic sound. Bernard Herrmann was sent off to Germany to have a look at the early version of what we would now think of as the synthesizer,
Right.
And was blown away by it. Coincidentally, he was looking at this in Hamburg, and he happened to go down the Reeperbahn and heard this band playing called the Beatles, who he really thought were rather good.
Wow.
And he tried to get them on the Ed Sullivan show in America before they'd broken even in Britain.
Oh, wow.
According to his wife.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Herrmann then took these kind of electronic sounds and added them into some of the real sound in the film to make the score, make the bird sounds particularly more horrifying, more electronic, more unreal. But what that also meant was that there isn't a note of what we would consider music, classical music, in the film. And of course, the greatest horror is no music at all. The greatest horror is what we're watching is actually happening in a world we recognize and an oral sensibility we all know, which is that we don't walk around with an orchestra in our heads. And part of the Birds' success is that as they gather, for instance, on the children's play equipment outside the school, there is no building music behind.
No.
Now, how good is that? Because it just becomes the flutter of the wings and a kind of thing. And we've gone back to Tippi Hedren a couple of times. I think she's having a smoke or something like that.
You do hear the children singing as
That's
well,
right,
don't you?
in
the nursery
background.
rhyme.
And the nursery rhyme's getting faster, which is interesting.
Yes.
But apart from that, you've only got that sound of the birds. And then she looks, and there are millions.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, if you'd added music to make that work, it wouldn't be anywhere near as horrifying.
Yeah.
It's one of the big kind of strange things about film scoring, particularly movie scoring. Music can draw you in as an emotional force, but it can also force you out because it takes away from the reality. The actual reality of genuine horror is that of not having any kind of musical safety net to tell you it's all right, this is just a story.
Yeah.
Because it's not anymore. It's actually really happening. So, for instance, it's interesting the sequences that don't use music and work all the better for that.
Yeah.
I can't remember much music, if any at all, in Rosemary's Baby. Rosemary's Baby.
No, other than that kind of la 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 at the very beginning. Yeah, no, beyond that, I don't think there's
not a lot in there.
Because there's obviously that famous sort of rape dream sequence, which is completely silent, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Yeah.
And you are supposed to be in a brownstone in New York in the 1970s.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that works incredibly well.
Yeah.
And that sort of la 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 thing, you can trace that back. It may go earlier than that, I don't know. But the fantastic British film, The Innocents,
oh yes, one of my
starts with the music actually with the curtains closed still. So even before the film started. So it starts, if you're lucky enough to see it in a cinema, in a darkened cinema, where the music is just this boy singing Willow, Willow, Waly.
That's it.
And it because
black,
you know the film is about child abuse ultimately, and ghosts from people from beyond the grave who still control these children and are still mentally and sort of supernaturally abusing them. By the time you get to the film itself, all of your senses are up and running, and it is like sitting in a tent in the middle of a field on your own and having somebody scratching the canvas outside, because you're it's like, oh my God. So it's the same. I think that's what's clever about that use of actually rather beautiful music. I think that was what was clever about the way that Kubrick used, very lovely music in The Shining. Midnight were the stars and you. Because there are times when it actually makes it worse that you're given music which is supposed to make you feel comfortable and relaxed and secure and sort of open up all sorts of emotional responses in you, when actually what you're watching is utterly and completely horrifying.
Here's Johnny!
Nowadays, for a modern horror film, a director has so many different options for how they can score what they want to score, or indeed whether to score it at all. Electronics has helped a lot. Obviously, way since The Birds. Now, for instance, if you were to buy a pack of sounds for a synthesizer or samples or anything like that, one of those may well be called horror movie.
Yeah.
And what it'll probably be, and whether this is Hans Zimmer or somebody else, I don't know. But for instance, that kind of sense of an electronic sound which becomes partly gong, partly deep drone, but you actually get a fade into that and then a kind of whoosh and then a fade back out.
Yeah.
And it is this kind of like sense of you are coming up to the door behind which there is something, you don't know what it is. And then you sound as it goes. That's fine. That is also a direct descendant of Psycho, because it is only marking the mechanics.
Right, yeah.
Not the emotional side of what you're doing. But the problem is that, in a sense, overuse of electronics for really just to sort of underline a shock moment or whatever, it makes for pretty thin emotional response to a situation. Yeah. If you want to come out deeply horrified from something, that it needs something more than that.
Yes.
A really fine sort of film with a really fine score will be able to make you feel the mechanics of horror as the genre, as the story goes deeper and deeper into the abyss, but also make you feel genuinely, personally involved in it. more than just as a thrill ride.
It's the difference, isn't it, between a lot of these recent horror movies, like the ones that people like Mark Kermode and Nigel Floyd call sort of cattle prod cinema, where it's at The Conjuring or whatever it might be, where it does jolt you out of your seat every 5 minutes, but afterwards you've kind of already forgotten about it. It doesn't actually leave you with that sense of unease or dread or anything else. It's just loud noises, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Whereas the actual sense of a sort of existential, a sense of, oh my God, that's me.
Yeah.
That is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And does kind of, I haven't yet seen it, but I wonder whether Aronofsky's the mother.
I just watched it last night.
And does that mine a kind of emotional involvement?
Yes. Do you know what's so interesting about it? No music, no score. And because obviously the trailer is so heavily scored with these strings and it's so shrill. And obviously other movies like Requiem for a Dream, and I was expecting this kind of big Aronofsky music. There's no score at all.
You see that it is obviously a very, very. It's not a decision made just by chance.
No, absolutely. And but the sound. There's one moment, I won't spoil anything, but there's one moment that's so horrific, and it's because of a sound effect. Two people got up and left the cinema because they were so disgusted.
Right.
Yeah, so it's the sound is incredible. Yeah, worth a watch, but you need a strong stomach.
Right.
And just going back briefly to because I think. It kind of veers off somewhere different in the 70s as well, with things like Tubular Bells for The Exorcist, and also all these kind of giallo movies that Ennio Morricone did as well, because and Goblin, and those types of pieces of music again seem very kind of uncharacteristic for horror, or what horror was at the time.
Again, I think it's worth looking at the world as it was at the time and the way that films represented that world.
Yeah,
giallo as a genre always struck me as the closest that cinema ever got to Grand Guignol. So the idea that you turn up to a night of horrors.
Yes.
And that those horrors are kind of presented in a very sort of theatrical way.
Yes.
So the music was very theatrical. And it's interesting how Hammer really mined the idea of stories, almost a kind of a literary sense when they were making their movies, and that you were watching a sort of a literary form within which Dracula operated, or the Mummy, or whatever. And so the music had this sense of almost a kind of formality about it, which would then trip over into horror. Whereas giallo was absolutely unapologetic. Let's get off on this.
Yes.
And so you do get this wonderful sense of kind of a driving score. I mean, something like Suspiria is just amazing. So bonkers.
Yeah.
And, wonderful stuff. And you can imagine, also a little bit of a sense I get with a few of the Giallo movies, that they are actually scoring the picture right on the moment. They're in a studio, they're watching what they're doing, and they're going, we'll get this next 2 minutes, and we'll improv what we're going to do with this.
Yeah.
And it's very free for all. And actually, I think hugely enjoyable to watch and listen to.
Yes.
Because it's there. It's kind of pleasingly horrific in a way that the slasher movie is something different.
Yeah, totally.
And I think also, even with The Exorcist, where you've got a sense of a composer, even with something like the Mike Oldfield, which wasn't written for the film, but a composer enjoying the process of the music and allowing a fair amount of music to breathe as well. I mean, this is the other thing. It's an addition to horror, which is actually, I think, quite a generous and crowd-pleasing element. Yeah. It's not just about being put out of your comfort zone. It's being put out of your comfort zone with a fair degree of style.
Yeah.
Cold mechanics is one thing, but a clever use of music to drive a piece, and also to kind of actually, you walk away still humming the tune after a horror movie. That's quite unusual, and I think is actually indicative of a higher standard of filmmaking.
Yeah,
you're not just worried about, well, how are we going to get them through this next scene where we've got to get them from there to there, and that's going to happen and that's going to happen. but actually saying, here's a shared awareness here, whether we recognize it or not, that the music is having a particular effect on us.
Yes.
Which, in the case of Tubular Bells, of course, is bringing baggage from outside.
Yeah.
It's bringing something into the movie that wasn't already there. In the case of Giallo, in which you feel the sense of these very good musos just having a ball.
Yeah.
That's but also the filmmakers are as well.
Yeah.
You're tipped straight into a world in which the sheer delight of both the storytelling and the way that it's shot for horror is absolutely palpable. I don't quite get the people who have sort of collected all the scores of Goblins and Dario Argento and so forth away from the movies, because for me that only works so well.
Yeah.
The beauty is watching how it works in the film.
Yeah.
But then that's the case with Morricone anyway, as far as I'm concerned. There's some fantastic Morricone tunes, but it's only when you see them in context that you realise just how brilliant they are.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that way about John Carpenter as well, actually. But I know a lot of people that do love just listening to John Carpenter. And obviously John Carpenter was doing concerts last year and was you just go and watch him play a synthesizer. It's craziness. I mean, do you think that John Carpenter, he seems to... People are still replicating, aren't they, John Carpenter music? It seems to have become very, very fashionable again in the horror genre, with movies like It Follows and things like that, where suddenly they're trying to bring back that 80s synthy kind of feel, aren't they? What do you think it is about John Carpenter's music that is so loved?
I think it's the fact that, aside from the fact he was using quite minimal sound, quite minimal electronics, what he pulled off, which is a really fine job by any composer, was to sum up the whole movie into a matter of a few chords and a few notes, so that you immediately, you have that there. You can take any amount of repetition of it. It's so strong. So for Assault on Precinct 13, that in it.
Yeah, love that. Yeah.
Well, that is extraordinary, to be able to pin the thing down to something as small as that. And in a way, as director, and one assumes he had spent weeks on or months on writing the thing, he'd put the project together. He had cast it. He had been working on all the background, how the film worked. He bloody well ought to have been able to write the score better than anybody else.
Yeah.
Because he knew it better than anybody else, and is able to boil it down to those few notes. Same thing with obviously with Halloween, where again you have this wonderful sense of a ticking.
Yes.
Which is obviously about the suspense, the waiting, the sense of something approaching, but at the same time it's moving very, very slightly around, not that much, but it's so iconic, and it is such a great, what in effect is a riff. If it was in the rock world, that would be a fantastic riff, which you would just go, if you'd done that, if you'd come up with that, that's it, that's a number,
that's the winner.
And Carpenter does it again and again and again and again and again. And it's interesting when it comes to him using Morricone for The Thing, is he gets Morricone to do a Carpenter.
Yes. Yeah. When you watch that film, you'd assume it was Carpenter, wouldn't you? It's really strange. Would. Yeah. I wonder what that decision was about. I wonder why he didn't choose to score that himself.
I think you get the impression that The Thing was his attempt at a much more luxury market end of horror. Ergo, it's got a much greater production values. Obviously, it cost a hell of a lot more. He got a big studio behind him, etc. So he may even have been told he needed to use a named composer, possibly. But then what he does is he persuades Morricone, as you say, to sound as much as possible like what he would have done.
It's brilliant. I'd really love to jump forward now into the 21st century because there have been some recent horror movie scores that have been fantastic and unique. I mean, obviously, as we've mentioned, there were a lot that ripped on people like John Carpenter. But there are people like Mika Levy doing completely unique things. And when you listen to the score of Under the Skin, it just stays with you, doesn't it? I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about that and what you think about that score.
It is a score that is, it's sort of it's Carpenter-esque in that it has so much information in very, very, very few notes.
Yeah.
But also, its brilliance, I think, is as much to do with the recognition of what the overall mise-en-scène of the film was and what our expectations were for the story and how they were completely wrong-footed in the process. In that... one of the things I keep banging on about, music is information. The more music you put into something, the more information you give people. Suspense is about not being given information.
Right,
Horror is about not being given any information at all.
Yeah.
And so for Scarlett Johansson's character to operate the way she does on all those different levels, who we think she is initially, who we then realise she is after a while, who we're then trying to still work out who she is towards the end of the story. The music, to kind of match that narrative arc, has to be as discreet as possible. But to make it both discreet and highly musical and highly charged as it's happening. We forgive me if I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs.
No.
We in the cinema are undergoing two linear experiences.
Yes.
One is the story of the picture as it's unfolding. The other is the music, because music is linear. And it's interesting how, in order to make an immediate impact on us as an audience, the music is much more likely to change rhythmically than it is to change melodically.
Right, yeah.
Well, except Mika Levy just completely throws that out the window. Her music is got so many twists and turns within what it's doing, and yet it is barely there.
Yeah.
That it's feeding you sort of information. You feel like you're getting a sense of the character being cracked open by the music, and yet actually the music is part of the process of wrong-footing us as well.
Yeah.
I think it's extremely clever. And I wish I could do it. I've never been able to make a small, discrete statement. This is why I've ended up doing orchestral scores for people like Douglas Fairbanks, because I like to just explode and splurge all over the place. But I take my hat off to people who can boil the whole thing right down.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how if you were mad enough to sort of take horror movie music genres from King Kong to now, what you would see is the size of the sound of the music going from absolutely massive down to now as little as necessary.
Yes.
With the right film and the right director and the right composer, so that you are left with very little comfort from the music. In almost every other genre, the music is there to provide a world in which this movie can ride on. Well, in the horror movie, it may do that, but it's much more likely to be the driver of our fears. Yeah. And as such, not an awful lot of music. The more music you give it, the more comfort, in a funny sort of way, you're doing it. The less music you give it, the more we're left isolated and terrified by what we may or may not see on the screen.
Where do you think horror movie scores have got left to go now, I suppose, looking into the future? I mean, I suppose anything is possible now, like you say. People can score, they cannot. Yeah.
It really is. I guess the next stage will be whereby sound and the manipulation of sound has got even more sophisticated than it already had. The very fact now that so much of horror movie soundtrack is the manipulation of the real sound that we would normally be hearing of people moving, of doors opening, of people putting a cup down on a saucer. All those things are kind of playable around with. And I guess rather than trying to work out where the next musical explosion is going to come from with horror, it's trying to work out where the next oral explosion is going to come from, what someone can do in manipulating a soundtrack.
Right.
And maybe that will be about what can be done with the human voice.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, the sort of manipulation of just spoken dialogue is pretty minimal, because you want still that sense of reality of people talking, except you can add something monstrous in the way of an electronics to a sound, to a voice. But maybe that's the next stage, is what people could actually do with how we hear people speak to each other. Because that's the next place I can see would be a horrifying place to be put, that somehow or other the voice isn't quite right.
Yeah.
But yeah, musically, the thing is wide open. And I really look forward to somebody taking a step that you absolutely don't expect. You know? I'm looking forward to the next horror movie that decides to make the only sound you hear a barbershop quartet.
It might be possible. You never know. Who knows? And I've got to ask you then, Neil, I mean, moving out of horror, but just broadly, do you have a favourite film score? And if so, what is it? What's your favourite piece of film music?
Oh, that is so hard.
Yeah.
I don't know. It changes time and time again.
Of course.
For all sorts of reasons. But interestingly, I suppose the score I've been listening to most recently, and this is partially because I have a 8-year-old boy, was John Williams' score for The Force Awakens. There is so much in that, in the way of a kind of depth of a deep understanding of human nature, and a real sense of the characters being brought to life by their music just as much, if not more, than they're being brought to life by their dialogue.
Interesting.
And curiously, we had the album. I say we've been listening to it in the car a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And listened to it over and over and over again. And I couldn't get enough of it. I just found I was just playing it over and over and over again. And then we watched the film again for the first time in 2 years since we'd seen it in the cinema.
Yeah.
And how all those music cues fitted. And once again, I know people go, oh yeah, well, it's John Williams, isn't it? Of course he's a genius, but of course he is John Williams, is John Williams, is John Williams. And when John Williams is being cheesy, there is nobody cheesier.
Absolutely.
But oh my God, as music to take away and enjoy, I still think he probably tops the list.
I think that's right, yeah.
In the case of Williams, there is so much to bathe in just the sonorities that he comes up with.
Yeah.
And such a broad sweep of different styles. As far as I'm concerned, he is our Beethoven. He may be writing for film. Not all the scores are perfect by any means. Not all the films are perfect. But to have a composer who is so strong and so prolific and can still write to such a phenomenally high standard, I think he's over and above one of the greatest composers we've got living on this planet now.
Neil, thank you so much for joining me. Just for people out there that might want to know, I mean, where can people find information about you, about upcoming projects, events, that kind of thing?
Well, I have a website, which is www.neilbrand.com, and I tried to put all my forthcoming stuff on there.
Great.
As far as silent film's concerned, there's a very good website called Silent London, which has got most of what's going on in London and around. And also, if you're interested in the mechanics of film music, I have a YouTube channel called Neil Brand's Bells and Whistles, which gets updated from time to time.
Yes.
But I try and put new stuff on there where I can. And I try and answer people's questions. If you've got something specific on your mind, I'm on Twitter, Neil K. Brand, or Facebook. fire it at me, and if it's at all possible for me to make some kind of response, I will.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Cheers, Mike.
Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to my guest, Neil Brand. Now, as you heard there's plenty of information about Neil, about his events, about what he does, all on his website. So please do check out neilbrand.com for more information. Thank you so much for listening to this bonus episode of The Evolution of Horror. Now, don't forget, we are available on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and most other platforms. Please do subscribe to us. Please do leave us reviews, ratings if you can. It really helps us get a boost. If you want to get in touch, please do send an email. Maybe tell me a little bit about your favourite horror score. You know, what kind of horror music you like and why. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter @evolutionpod. So that's it for this bonus episode, but please do tune in very soon, because the next episode in our Evolution of the Slasher series will be out on Friday, where I'll be chatting all things Giallo with Dan Martin and Alan Jones. So tune in next time for the Evolution of Horror.